Amazing. So, welcome everybody to this workshop on democracy and elections. Overall, oh, that's not how you, there we go. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we debate democracy and elections, the types of debates and the types of motions that typically are about democracy and other regime types. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about democracy as a category of government overall, what it is, some pros and cons of democracy in general. And then I'm going to go into a little bit about the actors that are typical for these motions on regime types and democracy, especially politicians, voters, and what I've decided to call political institutions. Most of the time they're called democratic institutions. But in this PowerPoint, I'm going to talk about democracy as a regime type, as a category of government, since in the global debate network, democracy isn't always seen as an a priori good that we talk about in debate. It is often held against other regime types, etc. But I'm going to talk more about that later. Then I'm going to go into some key impacts that we typically want to measure when we have debates about regime types and democracy. And then at the end, I'm going to mention some key points. So, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. But if there's anything burning in your minds, please do not hesitate to, I think Zoom has like a little hand feature or unmute or whatever fits best for you. So, how do we debate elections in democracy? So I think there are typically three types of motions when it comes to debating democracy and regime types. There is a type of motion that puts democracy against different regime types entirely, where you directly have to debate the pros and cons of democracy. This could be such a thing as this house prefers a benevolent dictatorship to an unstable democracy. This is a debate that I've had to do, especially very early in my debate career, where I was like, how can you even debate such a thing? Of course it has to be democracy. But again, young and naive. And I'll talk more about how that is actually a very balanced motion and how that's possible to debate later on. And then there's also a motion about different types of democracy, such as this house believes that developing nations should decentralize authority significantly to local province/state. So how leadership in general, how a regime type should be split up and how it should function within a country. Typically, this will be something that's about developing nations, because developing nations either do not have a democratic tradition or has a very short democratic tradition, meaning that they don't have as many democratic institutions, and there might not be even a centralized national feeling. So these are also the types of motions where being able to debate democracy comes in handy. Debating democracy and debating regime types overall, if you boil it down, is about figuring out what a good regime type is supposed to do, what impacts it's supposed to deliver, how it delivers these impacts, which actors that deliver them, and which actors are impacted, and then putting that all together into arguments. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this presentation today. And that is also leads me to the last part of how the last type of debate and we can have about elections and democracy, which is when we use democracy or the process of the democratic process as a mechanism in our debates. For example, such a thing as this house believes government should not bail out banks. As soon as you have government as an actor, you need to talk about the different institutions within governments, the different actors. You need to know their incentives to prove that either this is going to be, since this house believes motion, that this is going to be a thing that they're going to do, and that's how it's going to play out needs to be justified with some ideas or with some material from your side on how this works. So let's talk a little bit about democracy as a category of government. And I hope this doesn't get too abstract, but this was something that helped me a great deal when I was in my school's debate career. My coach made me read a book by Robert Dahl called On Democracy. He's this famous political theorist, so this will draw slightly upon that. But it actually helped me to think significantly about democracy as a form of government and how we use it in debates, because most debates are utilitaristic in nature, which means that they're judged by whose side has better impacts, like who saves the most people, who proves that the world is a better place on their side, which is, and how they prove that is, of course, a little bit more intangible, and in which way it's better is a bit more abstract. But overall, that's what it comes down to. And you can prove that with democracy or without democracy. So Dahl says that it's important to remember that democracy as a concept exists on a sliding scale, meaning that you don't have either. It's not much like me, it's not a binary. either you have, it's not like you either have democracy or dictatorship. You can have some features of democracy in a country and some non-democratic feature. You can have a more or less functioning democracy. And this means that they provide more or less the benefits that we would say a democracy has. This is especially important to remember when you were debating developing nations, because both sides will typically play tug of war with how well democracy functions in these countries. So overall, some of the benefits of democracy that are held up to be these good things is this idea of citizen participation. As a citizen of this country, you can vote and you can thus impact the people who make the laws and decide basically how you're allowed to live your life. This plays into another idea of democracy and another benefit, which is this idea of a balance of rights and responsibilities. So as a citizen in a democratic country, you get certain human rights, you get certain civil rights, the right to vote, the right to a fair trial, press freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of association, all of those things that are both needed to a degree for a democracy to work, but also are some of the key benefits you get out of living in a democracy. Then you also have responsibilities. For example, there's a responsibility for you to participate. Democracy is fundamentally led by the people, as referring to its old Greek roots. So you have some would say a responsibility to vote. This ties into the idea of a democratic tradition or a democratic mindset, because democracy is a relatively new form of government, and in some countries, it's a completely new form of government. And that means that if you don't have a people who are used to having a vote and who believe that this is a right the way that we in many Western countries take it for granted, it can be harder to implement a democracy. So there's both this idea that you might not have democratic, like the institutions necessary, such as functioning courts or parliament, or even like local governments, but there's also the idea that people might not want to vote. They might not see that as a rational thing for them to do because they've never been used to impacting government before, and they don't see the things that this would bring to their life. So there's also, I'll talk more about that in actor characterization, but democracy is ultimately a balance, about this balance of rights and responsibilities. And then there's this later idea, which also ties into it, the other great third benefit of this accountability of leadership, meaning that if you do have a president or a prime minister or even government officials who do not do as you wish, you as a voter, as a collective, have the ability to stop them. This can be done both via protesting and activism, which we'll also talk about, but of course, the main mechanism here is via voting. So these are the benefits. The downsides to democracy, which have been pointed out since the dawn of democracy, is mainly this idea of a tyranny of the majority, which means that if the majority makes bad or self-serving decisions out of malevolence or ignorance, then basically everybody in the country is fucked. Sorry. And especially this can harm the minorities. This also depends on how well developed the democracy is. Are there certain legal documents such as constitutions that provide good protections of the minority as there would be in more well-developed democracies, or are there not? There's also this idea that different rights in a democracy might conflict. In Denmark, we're seeing this right now because the politicians are debating whether or not burning the Quran is in line with free speech, or whether or not that's harming someone's ability to practice their religion freely. So there are certain rights that might at all times in a democracy conflict, and they have to be balanced out. And this is also something that can cause polarizations among citizens, etc. There's also a lack of efficiency often in democracies because everybody has to agree. So there's a risk of gridlock, which is this idea when democratic institutions such as parliament cannot agree because neither side wants to, if they're polarized and neither side wants to cooperate with each other, then you cannot get effective policy out. So no matter the great theoretical value-based impacts of democracy, if you cannot get efficient policy out to the citizens, then their lives don't significantly improve. And there's also, fourthly, this idea of short-termism. Because democracy, to ensure accountability of its leaders and to ensure citizen participation, has regular voting periods, politicians might really only have incentives to do well for the next 4 years, or however long 4 or 5 years, however long the voting period is, or the period is between the next election. And people tend to forget quite quickly what has happened previously in the democracy if it is not brought up to their mind. So there's a certain short-term memory also associated with democracy. Whereas if you had a leader who knew that they were going to sit there for life, they might be more inclined to make these long plans, like 13-year economy plans that would significantly benefit the country in the long run. But if you do that as a politician now, you know that the politicians who were elected 13 years from then might take advantage and might actually get the credit for the good times that you've provided. So there's less of an incentive to do that. Moving very fast, sorry about that. More on democracy as a category of government. Dahl has this idea. So that's all good and well and theoretical, but how do we actually debate this? Dahl says that if democracy is a functional concept, and that's the case for any regime type, we can then rate it in terms of how well it achieves these concepts. So going back to these benefits and downsides, we can rate any regime type in terms of how well they achieve these things, such as rights, accountability, efficiency, avoiding tyranny of the majority, avoiding short-termism, all of these things. And this can be weighed out in a debate. For example, whether you have benevolent dictatorship or an unstable democracy, you can weigh out in terms of you might have more efficiency, long-termism on one side, but on the other hand, you don't have rights and you don't have accountability of leadership. So weighing that out, and especially doing good characterization of what the people's lives in these different worlds end up like, is especially important for these types of debates. So the function of a democracy, or the function of any regime type, can be boiled down to, I can't count, four things. Firstly, this idea that they should represent the will of the people. So in a democracy, that's pretty obvious. It's about whether or not people think they represent what people vote for. I'll talk a little bit more about voting and voter behavior later on in the PowerPoint. This ties into the idea of accountability. There should be some sort of accountability. If you have a bad leader who you'd have no way of getting ousted with, or ousting at all, then it's more likely that the country will suffer. There's also, thirdly, this key idea of stability. People would like stable lives. Stability is good. Like, stability is key for anybody wanting to open a business. It's key to provide economic growth. It's key to provide for anybody to make future plans. If you feel like your country is going to get plunged into economic despair or a war within the next 2 years, then the quality of life in that country significantly is going to fall, which is the fourth benefit, or the fourth function, is to provide an increased quality of life for citizens. Most debates about regime types will ultimately boil down into who can get the best lives for citizens. So to win a debate about democracy, you must prove that democracy, or democratic processes, more so than other processes or regime types, ultimately lead to the stable and good legislation that is best for all. Let's talk a little bit about how we do this concretely, because so far it's been very theoretical. So the most common actors in any debate that involves some sort of political process are politicians. These can be any types of politicians. They could technically also be dictators, voters, which has some subcategories, and then what I've chosen to call political institutions, which is all of the other things we think about, such as like court, local government, all of these types of things that involve bureaucracy, certain ministries, etc. Then there are also some common incentives that are typically thrown about when we talk about these actors. I'll go more into detail with them in the later slide. There's a thing about job security. Politicians' job is to be politicians, and if they don't get elected, then their careers don't advance, they have lower job security, etc. So politicians fundamentally interested in getting reelected. That's not a hard thing to sell in most debates. Most people in general, whether they're politicians, voters, or people who work in political institutions, have incentives for self-preservation. They want to see increased quality of their life, job security, etc. And then there's also an overall incentive ideology. Whether or not politicians are ideologically motivated, or whether or not people are ideologically motivated when they vote, can be a little bit harder to prove, because it's much easier for a judge to buy that people are ultimately self-interested rather than that people have a deep dream of communism inside their hearts. So going with the ideological route might be harder to prove, but there are definitely certain examples that one can draw upon. And there are also, like, it's about, if you can frame it in terms of being like, people believe that this ideology is the way to getting better lives, then you have a higher chance of proving that politicians, etc., are ideologically motivated, which is also a common idea in political science, that politicians, yes, are self-motivated, but the reason that they do all of this, like if they just wanted money, they could have been like political advisors. There has to be some sort of ideological buy-in from them to keep fighting this fight that they're doing. This also plays into whether or not politicians should make alliances with other politicians, etc. There might be debates about that. So let's talk more about politicians. I already kind of went into it. Most of the time, there'll, in any debate that is about politicians, there'll be whatever side tries to stop this democratic mechanism. We'll talk about how politicians are slimy and self-interested, all of the things we've just talked about with their self-preservation instincts. So mitigating that or proving that they're in fact just self-interested is then a key there. There's also a degree, talking about the degree to which they have loyalty to voters. How likely are they to do what they've promised to do once they get into office? What mechanisms are keeping them in place, especially if they're democratic, if they're not democratically elected, if they're anywhere on the sliding scale of democracy. Then there's also weighing their loyalty to voters against their loyalty to lobbyists and corporations. In politics in general, there's this thing called the revolving door, which means that politicians who've had good careers sometimes step back, a lot actually often step back, and then immediately get jobs for lobbyist organizations. And how long they've had deals or been in talks with these lobbyist organizations, it's always a bit iffy to say. So, but overall, there's a key, it's a good mechanism and a good example to have in debates, that there is typically a tight connection between between politicians, lobbyists, and corporations, and especially weighing out how much power voters and voter protests, for example, when it comes to the climate change movement, has compared to corporations, who can most easily get to politicians, and also proving where politicians' interest lies. Is it more profitable for a politician? Is it better in their self-interest to stick with the voters and thus hope to get reelected? Or is it more profitable for them to stick with the corporations and hope for a big fat lobbyist check or in their job as a lobbyist in the future? So framing that and proving why politicians, if they're self-interested, even if they're self-interested, especially if they're ideologically motivated, will do one or the other is good. And the typical things that you can draw upon and use to justify is this idea of ideological motivation, self-interest. Then there's also, of course, internal political deals. Which incentives do they have to cooperate with other political parties? Should they cooperate with other political parties? Should they cooperate with like other countries in IR debates? It's similar things that they talk about. There's of course a greater long-term, short-term weighing when it comes to like international politics. But the two key things to remember is this idea of self-interest, job security, and ideological motivations. Moving on. So voters and voting are typically one of the key groups we think about more so when we think about democracy and elections. Whether they're voters or whether they're not in a democracy and so they're just citizens, they have the ability to do activism still. So we are still going to talk about that. Elections. If you talk about how elections are going to play out in a debate, it's very important that you justify how citizens or how voters are likely to vote and why. And when you do that, it's important to consider if they have access to all the facts to vote in their own best interest. Because often we assume that we like to assume that people are perfectly rational and that they'll do the thing that is best for them. So they'll vote for the politician that will give them the best lives ultimately. And that's also what we're trying to prove, that these politicians are able to give them the best life. This is not always true. And this is an important thing to call other debaters out for and other teams out for. They just start talking about like, yeah, but people are rational, they're going to vote for this because it's better. We don't always have access to all of the information that we need to make what would objectively be the best choice. And that is number A. And number B is that we don't always want to do that with our voting. We can do such a thing as protest voting. For example, by abstaining from participating, a significant, a growing tendency in French politics is to not vote as a way to protest the current voting system where the two final candidates face off, thus giving voters less choice. Would it objectively have been smarter for people to vote to at least get the candidate that they feel would do the less harm? Maybe, but as a citizen, you technically also have the right to abstain from voting or to vote for someone very far out in order to protest the current regime. So people might do that. People might also be very compelled by the rhetoric of a certain person. This is hard to do in debates because often debaters will be like, yes, but the poor, disenfranchised, working class voters will always vote for the right wing because they're not smart enough. So of course you have to do this without sounding elitist, but talk about how if you do not have access to all the information, but the information you are given clearly points you towards one political candidate, why A, you are likely to do this, and why B, it's still legitimate for you to do this as a voter. So remember those things when talking about voters and their behavior in elections. Then there's also the question of activism. That's another mechanism really that's typically used in debates about things will happen. Like we talk about the climate, there are certain debates about the climate change movement, etc. But often I hear debaters go, yes, but people will protest. Okay, good. Why are they incentivized to protest? Why specifically are people likely to take time out of their day to go protest something like that? Even if you're angry, you don't necessarily take action upon that. So there's a burden of proving that people will take action and actually take time out of their lives to go stand with a sign and yell at a building with politicians inside. Also, why will this yelling sway the politicians? That's again when you go back to the incentives that politicians have: ideological, self-preservation, job security, etc., and talk about how this is likely to change their behavior. And then there's also a question of backlash versus buy-in. I could do a whole lecture on political activism. I'm sure you can find all the stuff like that on YouTube. But generally, the things to balance out is that either a movement will get significant buy-in, which means that people will go, other people are protesting, that I agree with that, I should go protest too, and then you get more protesters, or there'll be backlash to this protesting, either in the form of counter protests or people going, I think it's stupid that they're protesting, I'm not going to do that, or politicians refusing to be swayed by it, etc. So there's that balance to play out. I'm happy to answer more questions about that later, but this is a minor part, so I'm going to go over it rather quickly. Then the third actor, as we've already talked a little bit about, is lobbyists. This is the idea that there are these huge corporations, they have a lot of money, they have a lot of power, they have a lot of access to politicians, and they have and then you have to debate to what degree they have influence over politicians and political institutions compared to the average voter who isn't employed by the tobacco sector, etc. So they're always taking lobbyists into concern, especially when it's that this house believes that motion, or when it's you have equal fiat. This house would, even if this house would, will have this house would bail out big banks. You do have or this house would never bail out big banks. You do have incentives to say that that's going to happen, but there might still be backlash to other things, etc. So you can bring up a lobbyist backlash argument. At least I think I might be saying weird stuff, not, but I don't think I am. Okay, the third actor, overly speaking, is political institutions. As we've already talked a little bit about, democracy and any regime type's success depends a lot about the stability of the institutions, which depends on overall regime stability. How likely is the current guy to get ousted? There might be instability both in dictatorships and authoritarian regimes. There might also be instability in democratic regimes. Sweden didn't have, for 3-4 years ago, Sweden didn't have a prime minister for a year because there was major gridlock. That's both an efficiency problem, but that's also instability because they changed prime ministers really quickly. So that's a downside. But also there might be instability, but Sweden, because it's a developed democracy, has stable political institutions. Whereas if it was a developing democracy or a new democracy or an authoritarian regime without sufficient democratic political institutions, the instability might have greater impact. So that's also one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is which legal documents are these institutions governed by? Are there, for example, a strong constitution in the country that ensures, for example, that they can't screw over minorities? Or that they can't, you can't suddenly change the courts to be more swayed by the government, as is currently happening in Israel, and as it happened in Poland, I believe 5 years ago, stuff like that. This is typically more important to consider in debates about developing nations and developing democracies. But as I've just said with some examples, it can also happen in in what we consider stable or well-developed democracies that have persisted for over 10 years. Then there's also, of course, the enemy of all efficiency, bureaucracy. This is really common in political institutions. Anytime a team is like, yes, but we'll get that through super quick and then everybody will enjoy it. There's, of course, like, you can mitigate that, but never fully rebut it by talking about bureaucracy in these institutions. I've already talked about there's a question of the level of development. There's also a talk about the level of corruption in the country that can also impact efficiency of these political institutions. And then there's, when you talk about political institutions overall, there's a key weighing of long-term versus short-term. Is this a big, like, if it's a really big political thing that the other side is trying to get through, it might take a lot of time to get through the political institutions, but it might benefit a lot long-term, versus not going through political institutions. Is there a short-term benefit to having someone who can circumvent political institutions in a more authoritarian regime and thus get policy out quickly, etc.? So I think it was supposed to be 25 minutes, so I'm going a little bit over time, but I'm sorry about that. I'm speaking very fast also. Let's talk about some of the key impacts that I typically see in debates about regime types and democracy. I've put these into concrete impacts and principled impacts, because often in debates about regime types and in debates where democracy is being discussed, either side will have either a principled or a concrete like type of impacts. In terms of the concrete impacts that a regime type can have, you can talk about stability. I've already talked about why that's important. The question of efficiency, how fast can you get policy out to the citizens that's going to improve their lives, going to change their lives in any way? And thirdly, the quality of life for these citizens. On which side are they likely to have a higher quality of life, and why? Is it because they have rights, etc.? This is then ties into the principled impacts of, there's this idea of rights as a human being. This is a very like liberalist principle. As a human being, you're born free and you're born equal unless you have the right to rights, such as human rights, etc. Right to, when we even take it as too far as say right to housing, socioeconomic rights, stuff like that. This is typically something that the side arguing for democracy would be more compelled to weigh very heavily. There's then this weighing you have to do between rights and like the quality of life. Because yeah, sure, if I am someone living in a developing country, I might be glad to have the right to free speech and the right to what's it called, the right to religion, and the right to have freedom of association, like the right to protest. But if this doesn't significantly improve my quality of life day to day, because I'm living under an unstable democracy where it's hard to get policy through in a very poor country, and it might be easier if someone could just say, okay, fine, now we take all the land and give it to these people, or now everybody has to grow maize because that's going to be significantly better for your nutrition and for your farming output. And B, I might also not care about rights if I'm not brought up in a democratic tradition. If I don't have any idea, a priori idea that democracy is good, why should I care about democratic rights? So there's a weighing there. Then there's also a principled impact of accountability, that fundamentally the people who decide what happens to you should be accountable to you. They shouldn't just tie into, that's again this idea that you're born a free and equal person. They can't just boss around with you, because we don't, like, that's a, it's hard to explain these principles. So if you do decide to go the principled route, it's important. I think there's another lecture in this series about principled arguments specifically, and they explain it much greater how to do a successful principle. But it's important that you are very clear about why these principles outweigh practical benefits. And then thirdly, there's a principle about equality, why you're perhaps more likely to get equality in a democracy, or why you're more likely to get equality somewhere else. But in general, this idea that we're all born equal, majority or minority, that is kind of more intuitive to explain. So those are some of the overall impacts. To wrap up, I have a little list of things to remember when you're debating democracies and elections. Firstly, remember that in international debate, democracy is not an a priori good. I learned that lesson the hard way when I first started debating, that you can't just go, but this is democracy and we'd much rather have that. There are plenty of examples of non or lesser democratic countries who are very good at debate, and B, who are quite successful. I recommend looking up the government or the regime type in Singapore, watching some videos on that. There are some excellent YouTube videos that explain how what we in very democratic countries might not consider a democracy, how that is actually turning out for like to provide a lot of the impacts I talk about. So that's definitely a good example to bring up. Also remember that democracy is not a binary. It's not either democracy or dictatorship. You can have levels of stable democracy, and you can have levels of a sliding scale between democracy and authoritarianism, some democratic institutions, some success in voting. And depending on where you are, the impacts and the benefits and also the cons of democracy change significantly. So adapting the debate and clarifying what type of democracy and what regime type you're talking about in framing or in the beginning is very, very important to have set up a good debate for either side. Thirdly, remember that democratic norms take time to develop in a country. You can't just go like, then we'll have democracy and then everybody will be happy. I've already given some examples of characterization earlier about why people might not necessarily care about right as much as they care about improvement of their daily lives. You could do the exact, it's also intuitive to do the opposite and say, obviously I care about rights much more, etc. And then lastly, trying to separate the ideal of democracy from the actuality of most democratic governments, which ties into what I talked about with seeing what type where it exists on the sliding scale. And remember that you can have both value judgment when it in these debates, such as this regard for principles, but also empirical judgment. How much does it actually improve my quality of life? How can we see that it's improving the people who live in the lives of the people who live there? So both of these are necessary. And sometimes you can win a debate on one side, but you can't win it on the other. And I've been judging plenty of debates, even at Worlds this year, where we sat with this idea of, okay, should we give it to this principled idea of equality, or are the empirical benefits we see more important? So remember this. I hope that you've learned something and that it didn't all go too fast. I know it's a very ambitious and abstract subject to take on that plenty of scholars have tried, but these are the key things I think to remember for debating.